The first thing I saw when I walked back into my childhood bedroom that night was my father standing beside my bed with an empty cardboard box in his hands, already folding my shirts into it, one sleeve at a time, with the same careful hands that used to pack my school lunches when I was 7 years old. And for a moment, I just stood frozen in the doorway, water still dripping from my hair onto the carpet, unable to understand what I was looking at. My name is Claire Bennett, and that night I had just driven 3 hours from Wilmington to Ashford, North Carolina, after losing the biggest contract of my career, hoping that for once somebody in my family would simply look at me and ask if I was okay. Nobody did. Instead, my younger sister Ashley looked up from her phone the moment I walked through the front door and said, "So it's true, you lost the contract." Not hello, not are you all right, just confirmation, delivered flat like a headline she'd been waiting all evening to read aloud. When I told her the resort project had fallen through, that it was nearly a quarter of my yearly income gone in a single phone call, she glanced toward our mother and asked the only question that seemed to matter to her, "So who's making my car payment now?" The room went quiet, and my mother, Diane, said only, "We'll figure it out," in that calm, rehearsed tone she used whenever she wanted a conversation to end. We, not Claire will figure it out, the way it had been for almost 2 years. We, as though my income had always belonged to the whole house, as though it had never truly been mine at all. And that was when I followed the sound of my father's footsteps down the hallway and found him in my room with that box. "Dad," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, "what are you doing?" He didn't look up. He kept folding. Ashley appeared in the doorway behind me, arms crossed, not even pretending to be uncomfortable. "Cody and I need more space," she said, as though that explained everything. My mother joined a moment later, resting her hand on my shoulder the way you might comfort a stranger at a funeral. "Sweetheart, they're talking about getting married. We thought, since you're back in Wilmington most of the time anyway." I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was breaking down completely right there on the carpet. And what exactly have I been doing these past 18 months? Driving here every Friday after my father's heart attack, paying for his medication when the insurance lagged, covering the mortgage the month the check came late, sleeping on a twin mattress so someone would be in the house if he fell again? Nobody answered, and then my mother said the 6 words I had heard my whole life, the words that had
quietly shaped every decision anyone in that family had ever made about me. "You always figure things out, Claire." Before I tell you what happened after that night, I want to ask you something, because I think a lot of you already know the answer in your own lives. Have you ever been the one person holding your whole family together while everyone else simply assumed you'd be fine, because you always were? If that's you, stay with me, because this story is for you. And if it means something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, because there are more stories like this one waiting. That night, something in my chest folded quietly, the way an old wall settles after years of pressure, because I finally understood what those 6 words had always meant. They weren't a compliment, they were permission. If Claire always figured things out, no one ever had to worry about Claire. No one ever had to choose her or sit beside her on a hard night and simply ask how she was doing. I turned to my father, who was still folding my clothes, slow and methodical, refusing to meet my eyes. "Dad," I said, softer now, almost pleading, "are you okay with this?" For just a moment, his hand stopped moving. I held my breath, hoping, and then, without turning around, he said the only thing he said to me all night. "I don't want any trouble, Claire." Not stay, not let's talk, not I'm sorry, just a quiet plea for peace at my expense in the room I had slept in my entire life. I packed the rest of my things myself. Nobody offered to help, and nobody walked me to the car. The only person who reached for me before I left was my grandmother, Eleanor, sitting in the back bedroom where she spent most of her evenings now, her memory slipping more each year, some days forgetting what year it was, sometimes forgetting her own street, but never, not once, forgetting me. She took my hand in both of hers, her skin thin and warm, and looked up with eyes that just for a moment were perfectly clear. "There's my Claire bear," she whispered, the same words she'd said to me since I was 5. I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her, and then I walked out into the rain. The drive back to Wilmington took 3 hours, though I barely remember any of it. What I do remember is sitting alone in my apartment afterward, still soaked through, staring at a folder on my laptop labeled simply "Family," full of due dates and automatic payments I'd set up over the years without ever once asking myself why. And for the first time in 36 years, I asked a different question. Not how do I keep this family afloat, but what happens if I stop? I want to be honest about what I did next, because I know how it can sound. It wasn't revenge. Revenge would mean taking something that belonged to them. What I did was simply stop giving them something that had never been theirs in the first place. That night, I canceled automatic payments, one by one. The property taxes, the insurance, the utilities I'd quietly added to my own accounts 2 years earlier so no one would notice. Ashley's car payment, gone. I didn't slam a door or send an angry message. I just closed each tab the way you might turn off the lights in a house before leaving it for the last time. The calls started 3 days later. Ashley first, furious about a late notice from the bank. Then a mother, her voice tight with confusion, asking why the insurance company had called about a lapsed policy. Then my father, who almost never called at all, asking if I had forgotten something. Not one of them asked how I was doing after losing my biggest contract. Not one asked if I was eating or sleeping or scared about my business surviving the year. They wanted to know about the money. Only the money. And somewhere in the silence after those calls, I finally understood, without anger, exactly what I had been to that family. Not a daughter, a safety net. A line item that paid for itself by never once asking for anything in return. I should say here that I don't think my family woke up one day and decided to be cruel. My mother grew up the same way I did, learning that love and usefulness were the same thing, and she passed that lesson down without ever realizing it was a wound and not a gift. My father had spent his whole life solving problems with his hands, and now that his body couldn't do that anymore, silence was the only language he had left for things he couldn't fix. Even Ashley, 26 and frightened in ways she couldn't say out loud, had grown up watching me carry everything and learned without meaning to that someone else would always catch her. None of that excused what happened that night, but it helped me understand it. And understanding, I learned, can exist right alongside a boundary. Here is the part of this story that no one in my family knew. 3 years before any of this happened, long before my father's heart attack, long before the cardboard box, my grandmother had told me, on a quiet afternoon when her memory was still sharp, about a small beach house on Oak Island, perched above the dunes, with a porch that faced the Atlantic, and a kitchen window where she used to watch the sunrise as a young bride. She'd lost that house decades ago during years when money was tight and choices were few, and once, when she thought no one could hear her, I'd watched her cry over an old photograph of it at her kitchen table. I never forgot that. 3 years ago, on a slow weekend between restoration jobs, I drove out to Oak Island just to see if the house still existed. It did. Sagging and neglected, the porch board soft with rot, the paint peeling in long curls. But the bones of it were good, and the view from that porch was exactly as she'd described, endless and silver and alive.
I bought it that same month, quietly, with money I'd saved long before anyone in my family began depending on me. And over the next 3 years, on weekends when I told everyone I was working a job 2 counties over, I restored it myself, board by board. New railings, new windows that caught the morning light the way she remembered. A kitchen painted the soft blue of the sky just before sunrise. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because even while I was drowning, some part of me wanted to give one person in my life something they had never asked for and never expected. A few weeks after that night in Ashford, my grandmother turned 80, and the family gathered at the house for a small party. I could feel the tension the moment I walked in. My mother seemed braced for an argument. Ashley seemed to expect, despite everything, that guilt might still loosen my wallet. My father said almost nothing, the way he'd said almost nothing for weeks. I walked past all of them and knelt beside my grandmother's chair, placing a small wrapped box in her lap. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single brass key. She turned it over in her fingers, confused, her eyes searching my face. "What's this for, Claire Bear?" I smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel forced. "Come with me," I said. "I want to show you something." An hour later, we stood together on a quiet stretch of Oak Island, the wind coming soft and salty off the water, and in front of us sat a small white beach house with a wraparound porch and a kitchen window glowing pale blue in the afternoon light. My grandmother went very still. Her hands began to tremble. "No," she whispered, almost to herself, "it can't be." I placed the key gently into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "It belongs to you, Grandma. It always should have." She looked up at the house, then down at the key, then back again, and the tears that came were not quiet ones. They were the kind that come from somewhere deep, somewhere that has been waiting decades to be allowed to feel something again. "Nobody," she said, her voice breaking, "nobody has ever done something like this for me." I wrapped my arms around her, there on the sandy path, with the ocean sighing behind us, and I cried too, harder than I had in years, because she was wrong. She had done something for me, more times than she probably ever realized. Every time she called me Claire Bear, when no one else in that house remembered to say my name with kindness. In the months that followed, I won't pretend everything in Ashford was suddenly fixed, because it wasn't, and I think that's the honest part of this story. Ashley sold the car she could no longer afford and bought an older one in cash, something I'm told she's quietly proud of now. My parents had a few hard conversations about money they'd clearly been avoiding for years, conversations that, for the first time, didn't have my name attached to the solution. My father never called to apologize, but about 2 months after the birthday party, an envelope arrived at my apartment, addressed in his handwriting, with no return address. Inside was a single folded page, only a few lines long, the kind of letter a man writes when he doesn't trust himself to say the words out loud. It didn't fix everything. It didn't undo the cardboard box, or the silence, or the years before it. But it ended with 4 words I had been waiting 36 years to read. "I'm sorry, Claire Bear." He had borrowed her name for me because it was the only way he knew how to begin. As for me, I still drive to the coast most weekends, but now I drive to Oak Island, where my grandmother sits on her porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the same sunrise she watched as a young woman, finally home again after 60 years. Sometimes I sit beside her and we don't say much at all. We don't need to. I learned something that year that I carry with me every day now. For most of my life, I thought my job was to be everyone else's foundation, quietly holding the whole structure up while no one ever checked underneath to see if it was cracking. But a person cannot spend their whole life being a roof for people who never once asked if it was raining on you. The moment I stopped being everyone's safety net was the same moment I finally became my own home. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the Kind Souls Stories so you don't miss the next one. And if you've ever felt like the only one holding your family together, tell me in the comments, because I promise you, you are not alone, and your worth was never measured by what you could give away.